Hi students, this video is going to show you how to take a standard, then how to unpack the standard, and then turn that standard into measurable learning objectives. Here we go. So the standard that I chose today is a third grade math standard. By looking at this standard, you can see it's a third grade math standard because of the coding that it has. The 3 stands for third grade. MD is the mathematics domain called measurement and data. A is that first topic within measurement and data, and then this is standard number 1. So let's read the standard. The standard says, tell and write time to the nearest minute and measure time intervals in minutes. Solve word problems involving addition and subtraction of time intervals in minutes, e.g. by representing the problem on a number line diagram. So for this standard, third graders will be reading and reading clocks, they'll be writing time, telling time. They're going to have to measure time intervals, also known as elapsed time. Then they're also going to have word problems involving addition and subtraction of time intervals or elapsed time. The EG tells me one way that students can solve word problems, but this is not the only way. This is an example of how students can use a tool like a number line to help them represent time elapsing. So when you're ready to unpack your standard, it's important that you start pulling out the verbs that you see in the standard. So the verbs are the things that students are going to be able or need to be able to do. So they're going to be able to need to be able to tell time and write time. They're going to be needing to measure time intervals, and they're also going to be needing to solve. So these verbs helps us understand what students need to do. Next, look at your nouns. So the nouns we have are time intervals, and word problems. So these are all the topics that students are going to need to know when working through this standard. Finally, we need to know what students need to understand. This understand often is the context in which students will be working or the content limits. In third grade, students are doing this to the nearest minute. In second grade, they do this to the nearest 5 minutes. And in first grade, they're telling and writing time to the nearest half hour. So those details are really important when unpacking a standard. So you can see that my content limits or my context for the standard is to the nearest minute. The time intervals will be in minutes, and my addition and subtraction or my word problems will be involving addition and subtraction of time intervals in minutes. All really important things to think about when you're unpacking a standard. Once you've looked at all of those components, it's time to start breaking that standard into smaller chunks. So here's how I've unwrapped all of those parts. First thing that students have to do is tell time to the nearest minute. The next thing they'll have to do is write time to the nearest minute. Then they'll need to measure time intervals in minutes. And finally, solve word problems involving the addition and subtraction of time intervals in minutes. As I sequenced this unwrapping of the standards, I thought about what would happen, what would be the easiest skills and the first skills I would want students to develop, and then I moved into the more complex skills. So you can see telling time and writing time are my easier skills, where word problems are my more rigorous and more challenging skills for students. After you've broken your standard down and unwrapped it into smaller parts, it's time to start writing your objectives. So let's look at the objectives that I came up with in relation to each of these parts of the standard. Standards are very dense. They take days, weeks to develop. So as you see me reveal my objective, be thinking about how long would it take you to teach each of these things. All right, so first we're going to start here. Tell time to the nearest minute. I have two objectives that are coming from this part of the standard. Here we go. Students will tell time to the nearest minute by reading digital clocks. So one thing that it didn't tell me in the standard was this idea of digital and analog. But my background knowledge of clocks, I know that there's two ways to read time. And so I've broken this standard into daily learning objective. So students would be reading digital clocks. The next one is students will tell time to the nearest minute by reading analog clocks. These two objectives are very similar. These two objectives are very similar, and they could be taught in the same day, and they could be developed over a couple days. The next one is write time to the nearest minute. So students will need to write time to the nearest minute by correctly placing the hour and minute on a digital clock. And my second objective is students will write time to the nearest minute by correctly placing the hour and minute hand on an analog clock. So again, I thought about both things that students are going to need to be able to do with writing time. And these two could be taught together if I wanted, or they could be taught separately. When I think about my objectives, do you notice how each of them say students? This is telling me who my audience is. Next, you'll notice I use a verb. See how those verbs are connected to the verbs within the standard? For these two objectives on writing time, the verb I use is writing. On the last two, where I had students telling time, the verb I used was to tell. Notice how I have some of those context or content limits placed within my objective, such as reading to the nearest minute. And then I also tell you how they're going to do it. That word by is really important. By reading digital clocks, by reading analog clocks. This is what students will have to do. This is how I'm going to measure my students' mastery of these. If they can correctly place those hands onto the analog clock, that's measurable. I can observe it and I can see if students are able to do it. Let's go on to the next objectives. So under measure time intervals in minutes, I came up with two objectives. First one, students will measure an interval of time within an hour by determining how many minutes passed from the start to end times. So in this one, I'm having them measure an interval of time. And this one I included within the hour. Because of my understanding of elapsed time, I know it's easier if I'm speaking within the same hour. For example, I started my math homework at 8 o'clock and I finished my math homework at 8:30. In that example, that's in the same hour, and it's easier for a child to calculate how many minutes have to pass by. When we look at the next objective, you'll see that the rigor increases, and I have it just a little harder because we're going to now have time in where our hours change. So students will measure an interval of time across hours. So for example, I started my math homework at 8:45 and I finished my math homework at 9:15. So this is still a time interval that only involves minutes, but it crosses an hour. It crosses from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. This is harder for students to figure out how many minutes passed, and that's why I broke this part of the standard into two separate objectives. This first one I might teach in one day. The second one, I might spend 2 days developing how to figure it out when we cross hours. For our last topic in the standard Unwrapped, Students are solving word problems involving the addition and subtraction of time intervals in minutes. And so my first objective is students will solve word problems involving the addition of time by representing events on a number line. So you can see my audience is there, the students. We know what they will be doing. Our verb is they're going to solve. We know they need to know word problems that involve addition of time, and how they're going to do it in my example tells us they're going to represent it on a number line that's measurable. I'll be able to look at a student's number line and see exactly if they are able to represent the addition of time on that number line and solve the word problem using that tool. The last objective connected to this topic is exactly the same, except for it says involving the subtraction of time. It's a lot for kids to learn a new skill like elapsed time and time intervals. You don't want to mix addition and subtraction on the same day that they're learning this new skill. So I've separated it out into 2 days. Now, when I'm teaching, I might do a third day where I mix them together. But for the first time I'm introducing it, I have to do small chunks that kids can really have an understanding of. Developing this skill of being able to take a standard, unwrapping it into smaller pieces, and writing objectives that are measurable for daily instruction is really an art of lesson planning. It's so important that you develop this skill. It's going to lead to more focused instruction. Now that I have these set of objectives, when I write a lesson plan, I'll be able to take one of my objectives and I'll be able to make sure everything I do aligns exactly to that objective. For example, for the last objective, students will solve word problems involving the subtraction of time by representing events on a number line. I know everything in my lesson should be related to only this. Now, I might do a little building background and talk about what we learned in prior days and connect it to that in my anticipatory set. But when I get to the actual teaching of this lesson, I really want to be focused on this objective. So I know my focus is going to be around word problems that involve subtraction, word problems that are involving subtraction of time specifically, and every resource that I use should be around that topic. In addition, because they're doing it on a number line in my objective, that's going to be the tool that I require students to use in that lesson plan. And when I get to assessing students at the end of the lesson to see if they learned it, that's exactly what it should look like. It should have students doing word problems involving subtraction and showing it on a number line. That's how you can ensure that everything is aligned. My my objective is aligned to all of my learning activities. My objective is aligned to my assessment. And then my objective comes from a larger standard, and it's still aligned to that larger standard. My lesson is just a snip of the standard that will be taught for the day. I hope this helps you in understanding how to use standards, unwrapping them, writing objectives, and aligning everything to a well-written objective.